so that a holy God could come and live amongst them. And so here is God dwelling amongst them in a new way. In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was God. In the beginning was the Logos, the Word, the reason. Word became flesh and dwelt among us. It's always been the heart of God to dwell among us. That's what He did in the Garden of Eden. God's desire is to dwell among us. And finally, in Jesus, the Word of God became flesh and dwelt among us. The word in the Greek for the word dwelt is the word skenu. Skenu is the word for the word tent. So literally, John chapter 1 says, the Word became flesh and tented among us, and pitched up a tent among us. And that's the reference to the tabernacle in the Old Testament, when God pitched up a tent in the wilderness so that He could dwell among His people. And so our Lord pitched up a tent so that He could dwell among us. And now, through His Spirit on the day of Pentecost, He's pitching His tent so that He can now dwell amongst a holy nation. And that's still God's heart for us tonight. He wants to dwell among us. But to dwell with Him, to live with Him, we need to become a holy people, expressing justice and righteousness and compassion. Did all this just end after the Acts of the Apostles? Well, I want to give you the bad news. It continued. So it wasn't just the early church, and that's the end of it. Let me read to you some of the writings of the early church fathers. So here's one of my favorite early church fathers, Tertullian. These offerings, that is put into the church's treasury funds, are the trust funds of piety. They are not to be spent on banquets, so no parties, on drinking parties, or dining clubs, but for feeding and bearing the poor, for boys and girls destitute of property and parents, and further for old people confined to the house. This is what the early church was doing, feeding the poor, looking after the elderly in their homes, for victims of shipwreck, and there were many, and any who are in mines, who are exiled to an island, or who are in prison merely on account of God's church. These are your responsibilities, Tertullian said. So great a work of love burns a brand upon us in regard to some. See, they say, how they love one another. So we who are united in mind and soul have no hesitation about sharing property. All things are common among us except our wives. We lived in a community for about 8 years. Started a community with some groups of friends in the UK when we were students, started as students. We shared all things in common except our wives and our books. We didn't share our books because lending books to Christians, they never returned them. So we protected our wives and we protected our books. And that was Tertullian, AD 200. Here's another one, Clement of Alexandria, another great early church father. All things are common among us, and the rich are not to be greedy. And it is not right for one to live in luxury while many are in need. How much more glorious is it to do good to many than to live sumptuously. How much wiser to spend money on human beings than on jewels. Clement of Alexandria. And I could go on. Throughout church history, there were groups that were radical, who took seriously the teachings of Jesus and lived out a life that was so powerfully different from all the other communities around them. And that's what God has intended, that we would be different, not be like all the other nations. Live a radically different lifestyle. How are we for time? No, we need to let Pastor Peter preach his heart out to us tonight too. Let me move on. Oh dear, something wrong here with the... Let me tell you about later on in church history, and you can read many of these. These are all available. Just Google, right? Thank God for Google. Right? We can learn so much now. Right? Just Google early church fathers, common property, and you just see them all. Continued for hundreds of years. It's the practice of the early church. It was only when it became institutionalized that all this died. Because it became embarrassing. Because the church became an institution, had big buildings. Started out as a minority persecuted movement, a people's movement. Now it becomes the establishment. Why? Because a certain emperor claimed to become a Christian. Therefore, if the emperor went to church, we should all go to church too, because, there might be favors. For hundreds of years. And even after the conversion of the Emperor Constantine, these radical groups continued to practice. One of the ones I love, and we haven't time to talk about Peter Volder and the poor men of Lyon in France, but one of my great heroes is Francis of Assisi. What a man, what a servant, one of the earliest to go and preach to the Muslims in North Africa. Very wealthy family, heard the call of God to sell everything. He was one of those who heard God say, sell everything. And as tradition goes, he left his father's house completely naked. He left everything behind to follow the Lord. So he started this Franciscan movement, which was a movement amongst the poor that went out to serve the poor. But unfortunately, what happened over time after Francis died, people began to donate land and property to this movement. So this monastic movement that had started out as a poor people's movement where they lived simply started to accumulate property, started to become landowners. And in the early years, it was fine. All the monastic movement were fine. But you know what? When there's a concentration of wealth, when there's a concentration of property, there is always that great temptation to misuse it. And that's what happens, sadly, to these movements. These were great movements. The monastic movements were great movements. Yeah, some of them were a bit strange. The Egyptian fathers, there was one that just sat on a pole to meditate and vegetate and had to have food sort of lifted up to him. But these were monastic movements who heard the call to live simple lifestyles. To live simple lifestyles. Some of it was a bit weird, and some of it they got wrong. I don't think poverty is necessarily godly. It isn't. Sharing is godly, but they heard this call to sell everything to follow Jesus. But all these monastic movements became big, powerful institutions with land and endowments and And therein lies the lesson for us in our mega churches. When there's a concentration of wealth at control by the tip of the pyramid, small handful of people, pray to God that they will be godly. Pray to God that they will be honorable and have integrity. But if they don't, just like that, they destroy a whole ministry and a whole church. And that's exactly what's happened throughout church history. It shouldn't surprise us. But amongst these monastic movement, they shared all things in common. So they were still practicing it. Look, you go read some of these for yourself. These are some amazing movements throughout church history. And I love church history because next to the Bible, we learn the most about our faith through church history. These are the cloud of witnesses. They've gone before us and they lived these things out. Let me now come to the end and talk about how we work out Jubilee today. How do we bring the kingdom where the kingdom touches every aspect of our lives? So for me, when I discovered the Jubilee as a young final year student at the university, I came back and shared it with about 15 people, 15 of my leaders in the Christian Union that I've been sort of teaching the scriptures to. I shared this idea. I said, look, this is my understanding of Jubilee, and this is how Jubilee's been worked out in the New Testament through the Acts of the Apostles, living this kind of way. Let's do it together for one term, and one term only. The other thing we said was, we swore each other to secrecy. We don't tell anybody else. Okay? Because we didn't want to embarrass ourselves. We certainly didn't want to embarrass God. So the fellas lived on 10 pounds a week. The girls lived on 20 pounds a week. No, not because they spent more. Because they fed more people. They were better cooks, you see. Nobody wants to come and eat when I cook. But, when the girls cook, then everybody wants to come and, eat. With the excess, so we pooled all our money together. We took out the 10 pounds, 20 pounds. With the excess, we gave the money to the overseas students who were experiencing financial hardships because of the increase in fees during the time of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. We swore ourselves to secrecy, but it didn't last very long. Word got out. President of the Communist Society comes to see me and says, Kim, is it true what you guys are doing? And I sheepishly said, yes. Couldn't lie. I had to say yes. But, we were so frightened that this was going to blow up in our faces. We didn't want to embarrass God. So we had to say, yeah. And I was stopped by the president of the Liberal Society when I was standing in a queue in a bank. And he came and said, Kim, is it true? You guys are doing this on a campus? I said, yeah, but only for one term. At the end of that term, it was our second term in my final year, we came together and sought God again. Should we continue? I said, yeah, kind of fun. So we did it again for another term. Then came the end of the year, the university year for some of us. Some of us were going to carry on doing further studies as PhD students, as perpetual students. Two of us within that group were going to go out and earn a real wage. And we used their salary. We then decided that we either finished or we continued. And collectively, we just had a sense we need to continue this. We wanted to continue this. And so we went into town to buy the cheapest house in town. It's been empty. It's a 2-bedroom house at the end of a terrace. Those of you who've been to England, you know what I mean. 2-bedroom house, cheapest house in town. Old lady had died there 5 years ago. It'd been empty. The place stank of urine, and that's why nobody want to buy it. Fine, we will buy it. No money. We had no money. We were poor students. Fortunately, some of the churches that I administered to heard about this crazy idea, and they donated us a gift to help us pay a deposit so that we could raise the mortgage. And in this house, the bathtub was next to the kitchen sink. So we always told people that we wash our dishes when we had our baths. The toilet was outdoors. So some of you who've been to England, you know these really old houses. Yeah? At night, you want to go to the toilet? Put your coat on. It's freezing outside. That's why we started. And we came from all different countries. When my dad visited me, he was horrified at the conditions. We had paraffin heaters and so on and so forth. He was horrified. But he called us a mini United Nations because we came from all different countries. And we were all living together, sharing all things in common except our wives and our books. And over an 8-year period where we lived like that, we ended up helping each other to buy houses. We never had a centralized ownership of all the properties. Instead, we gifted each other with deposits, with gifts, so that they could buy their houses in their own names. Back to private ownership. The principles of the Jubilee. You see, the monastic movement concentrated all the wealth in some kind of trust, and if you control that trust, you are powerful. The Jubilee model is decentralize it, so no one person can pull the lever of influence over that wealth. So everyone individually helped to own their own houses. We owned it, in the end, owned 12 houses. There were 40 of us, and we were in and out of each other's house day by day, breaking bread. The community was not an end in itself. The community was an environment for us to do discipleship. The most important thing that we did every day was studying the scriptures. I took the view that if you can go to university and get a degree, theology is easy. Well, slightly. So we brought in people to teach us New Testament Greek. We brought in scholars to teach us Hebrew, scholars to teach us history, apologetics. And we gave ourselves to studying the scriptures. And that's where I learned the scriptures, from classical scholars who taught us Greek, from classical scholars who taught us Hebrew. We gave ourselves to equip ourselves for ministry. Not knowing where God was going to send us. We came from all different countries, but we were family. We rediscovered what it means to be family. And we shared all things in common. It was also an opportunity for God to deal with our addictions, particularly our addictions to materialism. And I believe strongly, had God not taken us through those years to tackle our addictions, He would not have been able to entrust the ministry that He has entrusted me with today. So that we can now hold material things lightly. It doesn't matter anymore. And you know, those years, we gave away far more percentage-wise than I've done since. It's much easier when you have little to give. When you have lots, it's a lot harder. It's a lot harder. That's why it's hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom. it is truly hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom. So for me, the community was our expression of Jubilee. There were no poor among us. There were no poor among us. Some of you here visited us when we were living in this kind of crazy way in community. We used to run Bible schools in the summer for 2 weeks to sort of pound people with scriptures and get them to study the scriptures for themselves. Well, those were formative years when God dealt with us and led us to live a radical different lifestyle. And to this day, one of the things I still practice, we always have people living with us. So we always have a young, single girl living with us, or a young single bloke, and it allows them, they live with us for free, allows them to save money so that they can get ready to start married lives, start a family. So that's been continuous. We've always, since leaving community, we're still living in community. And another thing, in terms of expression of Jubilee, the Jubilee is about a distribution of assets, of wealth. So on one hand, you need to create wealth through the land, the private property, through your asset. On the other hand, we need to be able to share this. In all my investments, as either a biotech venture capitalist or now in the area of social impact investors, we try and make sure that all our employees, our staff, are also shareholders, so that when we do well, they will do well too. Because when you pay someone a salary, more likely than not, they need to spend all of that just to keep alive, to meet their household needs. It's very difficult to have savings, especially if you're poor. Right? So salary alone isn't enough. The Bible, if I understand Jubilee, Jubilee is about a distribution of capital, of asset. And so in all our businesses, we have these stock options, share options that we give to employees so that when we do well, they do well. We've been blessed in that many of our employees have done very well because we've done well. And let me just tell you one story. When I built this private cancer hospital in Malaysia, after about 7 years, we then sold it, which is what I do. I'm a venture capital guy. I start things, build things, and I get bored, and we sell and go and find the next new thing to do and start again. Right? And keep starting and keep starting again. So we sold this to a publicly listed company. I had to persuade my shareholders to distribute shares, to give shares to the staff. Being hard-nosed Chinamen, they just found it hard, found it very hard. But they were persuaded, but they thought that I meant, let's give shares to the senior managers. I said, no, it's to all the staff, including our cleaners. They said, what? Well, you Singaporeans, you Asians, you understand. Cleaners, who are they? They're nobodies. Why should we give them our shares? It's our shares. To their credit, they agreed. Cleaners, we gave them 5 times their annual salary in shares. Nurses, we gave them 3 times their annual salary in shares. Distribution. And I wrote them letters. I won't go into the details of that to explain why this was happening. I would say, I'm a Christian, and most of my staff, they were Muslims. So I'm a Christian, I'm called by God to create wealth so that this wealth can be shared. And these are shares for you. Please use them wisely. You can do them with them whatever you like, but I hope you will use them to invest in your children's education. So 2 letters I wrote to them. We did a transaction. None of them have ever owned shares before, and nobody understood this magic check that appeared every 6 months called a dividend. So what is this? So they had to be taught. So we had to bring stockbrokers in to explain to them when they can buy, when can they sell, close periods, taxation, etc. A year later, my best staff nurse comes crying to me in the corridor. I said, Dr. Kim. She's weeping. She says, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to leave you. I said, why? Why? She said this, I sold the shares that you gave me, but that's only enough to fund my son's education in a university in the United States for 2 years. I need to go to the Middle East to work so that I can support him for 2 more years. She was crying and I was crying because that's exactly what we intended. You see, she was a single mother, divorced, bringing up this son. On her salary, she could never ever have afforded it. It's only with this capital, it's only with this asset that has been distributed to her that she's been able to afford this son, this opportunity. And I know that in 1 generation, her economics will be changed, transformed. That's Jubilee. That's Jubilee. In all our businesses, we distribute wealth, create wealth, we distribute wealth. What else is there? Let me tell you about the Buckbrook community. This is a community in the middle of England. They've bought some farms. They have a double-decker bus. They go out into the city, inner cities. They rescue these hippies and drug addicts and so on, bring them back onto the farm where they share all things in common. And they help these really, really tough individuals to recover, rehabilitate. And then they make them work on the farms, get them disciplined, get them off their drugs, get them off and deliver them from demons, set them free, proclaiming the Jubilee over them. Very powerful. And today they're called the Jesus Army. The Jesus Army. About 10 years ago, I had a phone call from somebody whom I had lost contact with in Perth, Fremantle. Called me out and said, Kim, the churches in Fremantle want to practice Jubilee. I thought, what? And they heard me speak in Scotland a number of years ago, well, many, many years ago, and just remembered that I taught on the Jubilee. Said, will you come and teach us so that we can practice this? So I go down, did a Saturday full day of teaching, and on a Sunday we had a celebration in Fremantle Square where the mayor was there. And then the following Monday, after Easter Monday morning, all letters went out to several of the houses from the utility companies saying, today your debt of X number of Aussie dollars have been paid by the generosity of the churches in Fremantle, and therefore we are coming to reconnect your power on this day. They went out and canceled the debts of all citizens who had their power cut, their water cut off, their telephones cut off, and about to be thrown out from the houses because they were in arrears with their rental. And throughout that whole week, the radio station at Perth stopped on the hour, every hour for that whole week, to say, on this hour, 3 more houses in this district have had their power or their water reconnected, courtesy of the generosity of the churches in Fremantle. Wow. That was their expression of Jubilee. Last year was the Jubilee year in Singapore. So for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been coming in to Singapore to teach and speak on the Jubilee. Care Corner, some of you will know. Care Corner, a wonderful organization, together with the YMCA, picked up this Jubilee story. And they decided to raise $1 million Sing dollars then went to the government and said, match us dollar for dollar, which credit to the government, they did. And they decided to cancel the debts of some of the needy families that they know